My name is Amanda Stephen, and this is the story of how my sister's cruelest moment became the day she finally learned the truth about what I really do for a living. The microphone feedback was still ringing in my ears when I realized that 200 people were staring at me and laughing. Not with me. At me. My sister Madison stood at the head table of her own wedding reception, champagne glass raised, that familiar smirk plastered across her face as she delivered what she thought was the punchline of her little impromptu speech. And here's my little sister Amanda, still playing dress-up in her little army costume at 35. Maybe one day she'll find a real job. The laughter rippled through the reception hall like a wave. These were Madison's friends, her colleagues, people who didn't know me from anyone. To them, I was just the family disappointment their golden girl was roasting for entertainment. I stood there frozen, feeling every bit as small as she'd always made me feel. But then something happened that I didn't expect. Something that would change everything. Grover, Madison's brand new husband, suddenly stood up from his seat at the head table. His face had gone completely white, like he'd seen a ghost. The champagne glass in his hand was trembling so violently, I thought it might shatter right there in his grip. The entire reception hall fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Even Madison stopped mid-laugh, looking confused as her husband stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear? Recognition? Something else entirely? His voice cracked when he finally spoke, and it was so quiet that the microphone barely picked it up, but somehow everyone heard it. Madison, what did you just say? If you're already hooked by this story of family betrayal and hidden truths, make sure to hit that subscribe button because what happens next is going to blow your mind. But before we get there, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where your own family completely misunderstood who you really were? Let me know in the comments below. Because what happened next would shatter everything Madison thought she knew about me. What Grover was about to reveal would turn my sister's perfect wedding into a nightmare she'd never forget. And it would expose a secret I'd been keeping for 17 years. But to understand how we got to this moment, how my own sister could humiliate me so completely at her wedding, I need to take you back to the beginning. I need to tell you about the two sisters who couldn't have been more different, and why I'd spent my entire adult life feeling like the family failure. I'm 35 years old, and I'd just returned from what my family called another one of my overseas trips. That's what they'd always called my deployments. Trips, like I was backpacking through Europe instead of doing things I could never talk about in places most people can't even pronounce. Growing up, I was always the disappointment, the black sheep, the one who couldn't measure up. Madison was 3 years older, and she was everything I wasn't. Valedictorian, prom queen, full ride to Yale. She had this golden touch where everything she did turned to success, and I had this talent for being ordinary at best. I barely graduated high school. While Madison was collecting academic awards and scholarship offers, I was sitting in the guidance counselor's office being told that maybe college wasn't for everyone. The day after graduation, when I was 18 and had no idea what to do with my life, I walked into a military recruitment office. I didn't enlist because I had some grand vision of serving my country. I enlisted because I needed to escape. I needed to get away from the constant comparisons, from always being the sister who wasn't good enough. The military gave me structure, purpose, and most importantly, it gave me a place where I could prove myself without living in Madison's shadow. For 17 years, I've built my life around 3 core values: duty, loyalty, and protecting people who can't protect themselves. These weren't just words to me. They were the foundation of everything I did, everything I believed in. But here's the thing about military service that my family never understood. The more important your job becomes, the less you can talk about it. By the time Madison graduated from law school and started her climb up the corporate ladder, I was already deep into a career that my family saw as playing soldier. Madison became this high-powered corporate lawyer with a Manhattan penthouse. She got engaged to Grover, the successful tech entrepreneur she met at some conference. Meanwhile, I was the sister who showed up to family events in uniform, if I showed up at all. My deployments meant missing everything: Christmas dinners, birthday parties, family reunions, and every absence became ammunition for more criticism. Mom would sigh and say, "Why can't you be more like Madison? She never misses anything important." Dad would shake his head and wonder out loud when I was going to settle down and get a real job. The only person who ever understood was my grandmother Rose. She used to tell me that some people are called to serve quietly, that not all heroes get recognition. She believed in me when no one else did. She died while I was overseas 2 years ago, and I couldn't even make it back for her funeral. That broke something in me that I'm not sure ever healed. Madison had this pattern of public humiliation that she disguised as sibling teasing. At Christmas dinner last year, she introduced me to her friends as my little sister who's still trying to figure out what she wants to be when she grows up. At our cousin's wedding, she made a toast about how proud she was that at least one Stevens sister had found success in the real world. When Madison got engaged to Grover, I only met him twice, both times over video calls when I was deployed. He seemed nice enough, but there was something strange about those conversations. He kept asking these weird questions about my service, about where I'd been stationed, what I did. But then, whenever I tried to give him any real details, he'd quickly change the subject. It was like he wanted to know but also didn't want to know at the same time. So when Madison announced they were having this huge wedding, I knew what was coming. I knew I'd be the family disappointment on display for all her successful friends to see. But I requested leave anyway, because despite everything, she was still my sister. I arrived 3 days before the wedding, jet-lagged and emotionally drained from my latest assignment. The first words out of Madison's mouth when she saw me weren't, "Welcome home," or "I missed you." They were, "Well, finally decided to grace us with your presence." Everything that went wrong during wedding week somehow became my fault. The flowers were delivered late. Well, if Amanda had been here to help coordinate. The caterer mixed up the menu. Amanda should have been here for the tasting. Never mind that I'd been serving my country while she was picking out centerpieces. The rehearsal dinner was the worst. Madison gave this speech as maid of honor to herself, talking about how wonderful it was to have family there to support her. Then she looked right at me and said, "Even those of us who are still playing soldier can take time off for the important things." The whole room laughed. Grover didn't. That's when I really started noticing him. The way he carried himself, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room like he was assessing threats. The way he stood with perfect posture even when he was trying to look relaxed. This guy had military training, I was sure of it. But when I tried to bring it up, he deflected just like he had on those video calls. There was something else too. His watch. I kept catching glimpses of it, and something about it seemed familiar, but I couldn't place why. It was nagging at me, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you just can't remember. The morning of the wedding, Madison made another one of her jokes. She saw me in my dress uniform and said, "What's next, Amanda? Are you going to bring a tank to the reception?" Everyone laughed. I didn't. I was standing there getting ready to be a bridesmaid in my sister's wedding, but all I could think about was leaving. Just walking away from all of it. The constant put-downs, the dismissal of everything I'd sacrificed, the way they treated my service like it was some kind of extended phase I was going through. But then I remembered something. I remembered the little girl who used to follow Madison around like a puppy, who looked up to her big sister like she hung the moon. I owed it to that little girl to try one more time. I owed it to the sister Madison used to be, before success made her cruel. So I stayed. I walked down that aisle as her maid of honor. I smiled for the photos, and I prepared myself for whatever humiliation was coming at the reception. I just had no idea that this time, Madison's cruelty was about to backfire in a way that would change everything. The reception was in full swing when Madison decided it was time for her impromptu speech. She grabbed the microphone from the DJ, and I knew immediately that this wasn't going to be good. I'd seen that look before. That smug, self-satisfied expression that meant she was about to make someone else the punchline of her joke. She started off sounding heartfelt, talking about family and how grateful she was to have everyone there to celebrate with her, and Grover. For a moment, I actually thought maybe she'd grown up, maybe this time would be different. Then she turned toward me. "You know, family is so important," she said, her voice carrying across the reception hall. "Even when they're a little unconventional." The crowd chuckled. Take my little sister Amanda here. 35 years old and still playing dress-up in her little army costume. Maybe one day she'll find a real job. The laughter that followed hit me like a physical blow. These were Madison's friends, her colleagues, people who didn't know me from anyone. To them, I was just the family disappointment their golden girl was roasting for entertainment. 200 people laughing at my life, at my service, at everything I'd sacrificed for the last 17 years. I felt my face burning with humiliation. Every insecurity I'd ever had about being the family failure came flooding back. Standing there in my dress uniform, surrounded by all these successful people in their designer clothes, I felt exactly like what Madison had always told me I was. A disappointment. But then something happened that I absolutely did not expect. Grover stood up from his seat at the head table, and his reaction was wrong. This wasn't the polite laughter of a new husband going along with his wife's joke. His face had gone completely white, like all the blood had drained out of it. His champagne glass was trembling in his hand so violently I thought it might shatter. I watched as he leaned over and whispered something to Madison. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could read his lips. "What's her full name and rank?" Madison laughed, clearly thinking this was part of the joke. "Amanda Stephen," she said loud enough for people nearby to hear. "And I don't know, some made-up military thing." That's when Grover's champagne glass slipped from his hand and crashed to the floor. The sound cut through the laughter like a gunshot. The entire reception hall fell silent as Grover stood there staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Recognition? Fear? Something else entirely? He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the dead silence. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but somehow everyone heard it. "Madison, what did you just say?" If you're wondering what could possibly make a groom react like this at his own wedding, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you think you know about this story. You see, what I didn't know was that Grover had a military background too. He was a former Army Ranger who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and in 2019, his unit had been ambushed during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. They were pinned down by enemy fire for 18 hours. 18 hours of hell, watching his brothers in arms get picked off one by one. His sergeant, a guy named Rodriguez, who'd been like a father to him, was bleeding out from shrapnel wounds. They were surrounded, outgunned, and running out of time. That's when the rescue mission arrived. Grover never got a clear look at who led that mission. It was a night extraction, chaotic and dangerous. All he knew was that it was led by someone with the call sign Phoenix 6, a female officer who somehow managed to coordinate the rescue of 23 soldiers under heavy enemy fire. He watched this officer personally drag his wounded sergeant to the evacuation helicopter, staying with Rodriguez while the medics worked on him. Rodriguez survived long enough to make it back to base, where he gave Grover his watch, the same watch I'd been noticing all weekend. Rodriguez died from his wounds 3 days later, but not before telling Grover that Phoenix 6 had saved his life. Grover had worn that watch every single day since, wondering who Phoenix 6 was, wondering if he'd ever get the chance to thank the person who'd brought him and his surviving squad mates home alive. What Grover didn't know, what my family didn't know, was that Phoenix 6 was my call sign. I was the one who led that night extraction. I was the officer who pulled Sergeant Rodriguez to safety. That mission earned me a Silver Star, but because of the classified nature of the operation, my family never knew about it. They never knew about any of it. And now here was Grover, staring at me across his wedding reception, realizing that the woman his wife had just publicly humiliated was the reason he was alive to have a wedding at all. The silence in that reception hall was deafening. You could hear people's breathing. Grover started walking toward me, his steps echoing on the hardwood floor. When he reached me, he slowly removed his watch, Rodriguez's watch, with hands that were shaking so badly he could barely work the clasp. "This belonged to Sergeant Rodriguez," he he said, his voice breaking. He gave it to me before he died from the wounds you helped treat. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Then Grover did something that stopped my heart. He dropped to one knee in front of 200 wedding guests and said the words that would change everything. "Madam General, I owe you my life." That's when the real bomb dropped. You see, what my family didn't know, what I'd never told them because military humility had been drilled into me for 17 years, was that I wasn't just some regular soldier playing dress-up. 3 months ago, I'd been promoted to Brigadier General. 1 star. At 35, I was one of the youngest female generals in Army history. My recent deployment that I'd just returned from? I'd been running counterterrorism operations across 3 different countries. But I'd never corrected my family's assumptions. I'd let them think I was just some low-ranking soldier, because that's what we do in the military. We serve quietly. We don't brag. We don't seek recognition. The look on Madison's face as the realization hit her was something I'll never forget. She'd spent years mocking a decorated war hero. Her husband owed his life to the sister she'd systematically humiliated in front of family and friends. And now 200 wedding guests knew that she'd just publicly mocked a general who'd saved her husband's life. I could see Grover's extended family in the crowd, many of them military, looking at Madison with expressions of pure disgust. The woman who was supposed to be celebrating the happiest day of her life had just revealed herself to be someone who mocked the very people who kept her safe at night. The golden child's perfect wedding was about to become her worst nightmare. The silence in that reception hall felt like it lasted forever. Grover was still on one knee in front of me, 200 guests were staring, and Madison looked like her entire world was crumbling around her. I could see the shock, the horror, the realization of what she'd just done written all over her face. I reached down and helped Grover to his feet. My voice was steady when I spoke, even though my heart was pounding. "You don't owe me anything," I told him quietly. "We all came home. That's what matters." But Grover was shaking his head, tears in his eyes. "You saved my life. You saved all of us." I could feel every pair of eyes in that room on me. These people who had been laughing at me just minutes ago were now seeing me in a completely different light. I turned to address the room, and when I spoke, it was with the quiet authority that 17 years of military service had given me. "My family doesn't know what I do because I choose to serve quietly," I said. "That's what we do in the military. We don't serve for recognition or praise. We serve because someone has to." Then I turned to Madison, my sister, who was still holding that microphone with trembling hands, her face pale as a ghost. "I've never needed your approval, Madison," I said, and my voice was calm but firm. "But I hoped for your respect." That's when it hit me. I was done. Done with the humiliation cycle, done with being the family disappointment, done with letting people who didn't understand my sacrifice make me feel small. I'd spent 17 years protecting people like Madison, and she'd spent those same 17 years mocking me for it. I started walking toward the exit. I was done with this wedding, done with pretending that family meant something when it clearly didn't. But Madison wasn't done with me. "Amanda, wait," she called out, her voice breaking. I could hear her heels clicking on the floor as she ran after me, still in her wedding dress. "Please, I didn't know. I didn't know." I stopped and turned around. The desperation in her voice was something I'd never heard before. She was crying now, mascara streaming down her face, her perfect wedding makeup ruined. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time in years, she actually sounded like she meant it. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what you really did. I didn't know about any of it." The room was still dead silent. Everyone was watching this family drama unfold at what was supposed to be the happiest day of Madison's life. "But that's just it, Madison," I said quietly. "You never wanted to know. You never asked. In 17 years, you never once asked me what I actually did over there. You never asked about my rank, my responsibilities, my missions. You were so busy making jokes about me playing soldier that you never bothered to find out what kind of soldier I actually was." Madison's face crumpled. She was sobbing now, right there in front of all her guests. Her perfect wedding was in ruins, but I could see in her eyes that she was realizing something even worse. She hadn't just ruined her wedding day, she'd lost her sister forever. "Please," she whispered. "I can't lose you, not like this." I looked at her for a long moment. My sister, who had been my hero when we were kids, who had become my biggest critic as an adult. The woman who had just publicly humiliated me on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. "Some things can't be unsaid, Madison," I told her. And with that, I walked out of her wedding reception. The immediate aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. The wedding ended early, with guests leaving while whispering among themselves about what they'd just witnessed. Some were talking about my service, about how they'd never known there was a general in the Stephen family. Others were clearly discussing Madison's behavior, and from the looks I saw, it wasn't favorable. I checked into a hotel that night and booked a flight back to base for the next morning. I was done pretending that this family understood or valued what I did. I had soldiers under my command who depended on me, missions that required my attention, and a job that actually mattered. But the fallout was just beginning. Back at the reception venue, Grover was having his own reckoning with his new wife. I found out later from our cousin Sarah that he'd confronted Madison as soon as I left. "How could you not know?" he demanded. "How could you not ask? She's your sister. She's been serving for 17 years, and you never once bothered to find out what she actually did." Madison's defense crumbled completely. Through tears, she admitted something that I'd always suspected but never wanted to believe. She'd never wanted to know the details of my military service, because it threatened her position as the successful sister. If I was actually accomplished, actually important, actually making a difference in the world, then what did that make her? "I needed to be the successful one," she sobbed to Grover. "I needed to be the one Mom and Dad were proud of. If Amanda was some kind of war hero, then what was I?" Meanwhile, our family group chat was exploding. Relatives who had witnessed the scene were telling everyone what had happened. Aunts and uncles were sharing stories about times I'd missed family events, and suddenly everyone was understanding that my absences weren't because I didn't care about family. They were because I was literally on classified missions protecting our country. My parents were devastated. Dad called me that night, crying, trying to apologize for years of not understanding. Mom sent me a text that just said, "I'm so sorry, I'm so proud of you. I should have said that years ago." But the person I felt worst for, surprisingly, was Grover. This man who owed me his life was now married to someone who had publicly mocked the person who saved him. I couldn't imagine the conflict he was feeling, the impossible position Madison had put him in. The truth was out now. After 17 years of quiet service, of letting my family believe whatever they wanted to believe about my career, everyone finally knew who Amanda Stephen really was. The question was, what happened next? 6 months passed before I heard from Madison again. I was in my office at the Pentagon, reviewing intelligence reports from 3 different theaters of operation, when my aide brought me a handwritten letter. The return address made me pause. It was from Madison, but it wasn't her usual pristine stationery. This was different. Personal. I almost threw it away without reading it. After everything that had happened at her wedding, after 17 years of being treated like the family disappointment, I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy to deal with whatever this was. But something made me open it anyway. The letter was 5 pages long, handwritten, and it started with 2 words I'd never expected to see from my sister. No excuses. She didn't try to justify what she'd done. She didn't blame it on wedding stress or alcohol or anything else. Instead, she told me something that actually surprised me. She'd been going to therapy. Real therapy, not just a few sessions to make herself feel better, but months of hard work trying to understand why she'd spent years systematically tearing down her own sister. Her therapist had helped her realize something that I'd suspected, but Madison had never admitted, even to herself. Her need to diminish me hadn't come from thinking I was a failure. It had come from her own deep insecurities about not being enough. "I was terrified," she wrote, "that if people knew who you really were, if they knew about your service and your rank and your accomplishments, they'd realize that I was just a lawyer in a suit while you were out there actually saving lives. I made you small because I felt small." She told me about her marriage to Grover, how it had survived but completely changed. He'd insisted that they honor military service in their home now. They donated to veteran charities, they attended military ceremonies, and Grover made sure that everyone who came to their house knew about me. Not as the family disappointment, but as the decorated general who'd saved his life. But the part of the letter that got to me the most was the end. Madison wrote about a conversation she'd had with our grandmother Rose's journals, which our parents had finally given her after the wedding disaster. Apparently, Grandma Rose had known more about my service than she'd ever let on. She'd kept newspaper clippings about military operations I'd been involved in, even though my name was never mentioned due to classification. She'd known about my promotions, my decorations, my importance to our national security. She was proud of you, Madison wrote. She understood what the rest of us were too selfish to see, that you were sacrificing everything for people who didn't even know your name, including us. What Madison didn't know was that just 2 weeks before I received her letter, I'd been promoted again. Major General. 2 stars. At 35, I was now one of the youngest 2-star generals in Army history, responsible for counterterrorism operations across multiple continents. And just like before, I hadn't told my family. Not because I was trying to prove a point, but because I'd learned something important about myself in those 6 months. I didn't need their recognition to know my worth. I'd spent so many years feeling like the family failure because I'd been measuring my success by their standards instead of my own. The truth is, I didn't serve for recognition. I never had. But I also served for family, even when they didn't see it. Every mission I led, every operation I planned, every soldier I brought home safely. I was protecting the life that Madison and my parents got to live. The life where their biggest worry was whether the caterer would mess up the wedding menu, not whether enemy fire would pin them down in some remote mountain pass. But before you go, I need to ask you something. Have you ever discovered that someone in your life was carrying a much heavier burden than you realized? Someone whose sacrifices you'd completely misunderstood. Let me know in the comments, because I think we all have people like that in our lives. I never wrote Madison back. Not because I was angry anymore, but because I'd moved beyond needing that relationship to define me. I'd found peace in knowing that my worth wasn't determined by whether my family understood what I did for a living. About a year later, I was at another military ceremony, this one for the retirement of a fellow general who'd served with distinction for 30 years. As I sat there listening to the speeches about duty and sacrifice and quiet service, I realized something. The little girl who used to follow Madison around, desperately seeking her approval, was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned one of the most important lessons life can teach you. You don't need to prove yourself to people who refuse to see your value. I still serve. I still lead missions that most people will never know about. I still make sacrifices that my family may never fully understand. But I do it now with the knowledge that my worth isn't measured by their recognition. Some of us are called to serve quietly, to make sacrifices that go unnoticed, to protect people who may never know our names. And that's okay. Because at the end of the day, the only approval you really need is your own. Madison may have learned who I really was at her wedding, but I learned something even more important that day. I learned who I was when I stopped needing her to see it. And that made all the difference. If you've made it this far in this story, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this don't get told often enough. Stories about the hidden sacrifices people make, about the danger of assumptions, and about finding your worth beyond other people's approval.